British history is full of scandals, but nothing quite compares to this one. The story of an American woman who turned the British royal family upside down. Her relationship with King Edward VIII led to the first voluntary abdication of a British monarch and changed the course of the monarchy forever. Let's start at the beginning. The year is 1896, and in a small Baltimore townhouse, a baby girl is born. Her name? Bessie Wallis Warfield. Her father, Henry Warfield, died of tuberculosis when she was just 5 months old, leaving the family nearly penniless. Her mother, Alice, would later say, "I couldn't give Wallis luxury, but I taught her how to act like she deserved it." Life wasn't easy for young Wallis and her mother. They lived on handouts from wealthy relatives, moving between apartments and relatives' homes. But Alice had big dreams for her daughter. She somehow managed to scrape together enough money to send Wallis to Oldfield School, Maryland's most expensive girls' school. At Oldfields, Wallis learned the art of social climbing. Her classmates remembered her as the girl who always looked expensive, even though she and her mother stayed up late sewing copies of designer dresses. One school friend later recalled, she wasn't the prettiest girl, but she knew how to make men feel like they were the only person in the room. By 1916, 20-year-old Wallis had her sights set on marriage. She chose Win Spencer, a dashing U.S. Navy pilot. On paper, it looked perfect. In reality, it was a disaster. Win turned out to be an alcoholic with a mean streak. But the marriage did give Wallis one thing, her first taste of travel and adventure. When Win was posted to China, Wallis discovered a whole new world. In the mysterious cities of the East, she learned things they definitely didn't teach at Oldfield School. During a mysterious period in Shanghai, she disappeared for several months. Some say she learned ancient Chinese secrets of love in the famous Green Door brothel. Others say she was having an affair with an Italian count. The truth? We'll never know. But when Wallis returned to America, she was a different woman. Back in America, Wallis wasted no time. She divorced Win and set her sights higher. Enter Ernest Simpson, rich, sophisticated, and best of all, half British. Ernest wasn't just wealthy, he had something even more valuable, a ticket into London high society. By the early 1930s, Wallis had transformed herself into one of London's most talked about hostesses. Her dinner parties were legendary. At one famous gathering, she served hot dogs to bemused British aristocrats, calling it American haute cuisine. Her guest list mixed Winston Churchill with Charlie Chaplin, proving she knew exactly how to keep powerful people entertained. Then came Edward, Prince of Wales, heir to the British throne and the world's most eligible bachelor. But Edward had a reputation. He liked older, married women, and he had unusual tastes. One former girlfriend called him Peter Pan, the man who never grew up. When Edward and Wallis first met in 1931, the sparks didn't fly immediately. In fact, Wallis thought he was a bit of a bore. But she played it smart. Unlike other women who fawned over him, Wallis treated the prince like he was just another man at her dinner table. She teased him, challenged him, and even dared to disagree with him in public. Edward was hooked. By 1934, Edward was completely obsessed. He showered Wallis with extravagant gifts that raised eyebrows even among the wealthy. A gold Cartier watch engraved with "The hours will fly," a diamond-encrusted cross from Cartier again for every milestone in their relationship. A different jewel for every part of her body, he joked. The royal accountants were less amused. Edward was spending a fortune from the royal accounts. Their behavior scandalized London society. At parties, Edward would follow Wallis around like a puppy, carrying her drinks and lighting her cigarettes. He even let her call him David in public, his family nickname that nobody outside the royal circle used. During official meetings, he would call her multiple times a day, leaving government officials waiting while he detailed every conversation. King George V watched his heir's behavior with growing alarm. He famously told a friend, "I pray God that my eldest son will never marry and that nothing will come between Bertie and Lilibet and the throne. The king's prayers went unanswered. On January 20, 1936, George V died and Edward became King Edward VIII. Now things got complicated. Edward wasn't just a lovesick prince anymore. He was the King of England and Emperor of the British Empire. And he wanted to marry a twice-divorced American. The British government, led by Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin, was horrified. The Church of England, which Edward now headed, forbade remarriage after divorce. The Empire's dominions, Canada, Australia, South Africa, all opposed the match. In October 1936, Wallis got her divorce from Ernest Simpson. The American press went wild with that story, but the British papers maintained a dignified silence. Behind the scenes, though, all hell was breaking loose. Prime Minister Baldwin gave Edward an ultimatum: the throne or Mrs. Simpson. For 326 days, Britain held its breath. Edward tried everything to keep both crown and woman. He even suggested a morganatic marriage where Wallis would be his wife but not his queen. The government said no. Meanwhile, Wallis fled to France, where she actually issued a statement offering to give him up. But Edward had made his choice. On December 11, 1936, Edward became the first British monarch to voluntarily give up the throne. That night, in a broadcast heard around the world, he told his people, "I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king without the help and support of the woman I love." Edward's brother became King George VI, and Edward was created Duke of Windsor. But there was a sting in the tail. The new king decreed that while Edward could be called His Royal Highness, Wallis would be never Her Royal Highness. It was a calculated snub that Wallis would never forget or forgive. They married in France in June 1937. None of Edward's family attended. Instead of royalty, the guests were a mix of wealthy Americans and European aristocrats. Wallis wore a famous pale blue dress that fashion writers dubbed Wallis Blue. She later said she chose it because it matched her eyes, though others whispered it matched her mood. After the wedding, the Duke and Duchess of Windsor became professional celebrities, famous for being famous. They drifted between Paris, New York, and the French Riviera, mixing with the stars of the day. Their friends included Marlene Dietrich, Cécile Vuitton, and Coco Chanel. They turned up at most exclusive parties, stayed at finest hotels, and never ever flew commercial. But in 1937, they made a catastrophic mistake. They accepted an invitation to tour Nazi Germany and meet Adolf Hitler. Photographs of them smiling and chatting with Hitler would haunt them forever. FBI files later revealed that many suspected Wallis of passing information to Nazi Foreign Minister von Ribbentrop. When the World War II broke out, the British government had a problem. What to do with the former king who was too friendly with Nazis? Their solution? Ship him off to the Bahamas as governor. The Windsors called it their Saint Helena in the Sun, comparing it to Napoleon's Exile Island. In the Bahamas, Wallis did what she did best. She redecorated. The governor's mansion got a complete makeover at enormous expense, while the Duke was suspected of currency dealing and the trading with the enemy. Wallis complained about the heat, the locals, and the lack of proper shopping. Meanwhile, Britain was fighting for its survival. After the war, they settled in Paris in a mansion on the Bois de Boulogne, rent-free courtesy of the French government. Their life became an endless round of parties, shopping, and gossip. Even their dogs ate from silver bowls with custom-made dog food. The Duke would sometimes play golf, but mostly they just entertained. Wallis became a style icon. Her orders from Givenchy and Dior were so large, they helped keep the couture houses afloat after the war. She famously declared, "I am not a beautiful woman. I'm nothing to look at, so the only thing I can do is dress better than anyone else." Her style rules became fashion law. No pearls before cocktail hour, no diamonds before 40. Their Paris mansion became a temple to luxury and excess. Everything was monogrammed with their initials, fresh flowers were flown in daily. The staff had to iron the Duke's shoelaces and measure the distance between the designs on the carpets to ensure perfect alignment. It was as if they were trying to create their own mini royal court in exile. But as they got older, the parties got smaller, their friends died off or moved on. The Duke spent more time reminiscing about his brief reign, while Wallis focused obsessively on maintaining her figure. "You can never be too rich or too thin," became her mantra. In 1967, they were invited to a royal ceremony for the first time, the unveiling of a plaque to Queen Mary. But the old wounds never really healed. When Edward lay dying of throat cancer in 1972, Queen Elizabeth II finally visited them in Paris. But even this reconciliation was complicated. Wallis and Elizabeth reportedly discussed fashion, while Edward drifted in and out of consciousness in the next room. After Edward's death, Wallis became a recluse in her Paris mansion. Her last years were marked by dementia, and she was rarely seen in public. The woman who had once dazzled society was now a frail shadow, surrounded by photographs of her past glory. Wallis died on April 24, 1986, at the age of 89. She was buried beside Edward in the royal burial ground at Frogmore, Windsor, not in the Westminster Abbey with other royals, but not entirely excluded either. Their graves are marked simply with Edward and Wallis. In death, as in life, their status remained unique. Their story changed the British monarchy forever. It led directly to the reign of Queen Elizabeth II, and influenced how the royal family would handle matters of marriage and divorce for generations to come. Was it the greatest love story of the 20th century, or a cautionary tale about the price of obsession? Perhaps. It was both. But it is for you to decide. Want more stories about people who turned royal rules upside down? Hit subscribe and let me know in the comments who you want to hear about next. See you in the next video. Bye bye!